Hello everyone, I am the Lore Explorer, and this video will contain spoilers for Outer Wilds Echoes of the Eye. In the last few videos, we covered the majority of the Alks and their story, from Home Moon all the way to them giving up on reality and dying to enter the simulation for one last time. But when you really think about it, whether or not you think the simulation inhabitants are alive or dead or real or not, this is the remnants of the Alk species living on in some form or another for hundreds of thousands of years. So I think it'd be fun to talk about how the Alks spend their time in the simulation. I guess it's obvious to say that they tried to make it as close to their home moon as possible here in the simulation, and they really do have a lot going on for them. Although we only experience nighttime while in the simulation, the developers have recently confirmed in a no-clip podcast that they in fact do have a night-day cycle. But as we know, the inhabitants are at least half owl, and so it seems they are a nocturnal species, mostly sleeping during the day and being active during the nighttime. They even simulated multiple landscapes so everyone could get the land they like. The Alks went out of their way to even recreate little comforts they probably had at home, such as their chessboards and fishing rods that we find laying about, or even their little spears for whatever reason they need those. We can even find what the game's code refers to as a hotel. If some Alks feel stir-crazy after being home for so long, which I imagine might happen occasionally being in a simulation that's run for over 100,000 years, they have somewhere relaxing to go visit. And this hotel is actually really nice. They have a wide open courtyard with ponds and rocks artfully placed to add to the scenery. There's a large gathering area for everyone to come eat or play games or just interact with each other. It has a roof above it, but the side walls are missing, giving some of the tables good views of the river below and an open feeling. On the bottom floor, there seems to be a dancing or banquet area in which they could have parties or even host events in. And they even have a stage outside of the hotel on which they'd obviously perform their magical musical musings and perform other forms of performance. They even have an art museum of sorts on the bottom floor where they have a few rows of paintings on view for you to see. But the niceties don't end there. This is one of the few places in the simulation that they coded in a projector room above ground. So I imagine people visit here a lot for that simple fact alone. And this projector room actually tells us something about the simulation as a whole, in my opinion. Despite their best efforts as a species, despite using all of their knowledge and technology, putting it towards building a simulation of their dream world, we still find an owl retreating to this dark room all alone to watch a video of their home moon as if they still miss it, as if the simulation isn't good enough to convince them that they are actually home. I may be reading too far into that, but it's interesting to think about in my opinion. All in all though, it seems like a pretty fancy hotel that I would love to stay at. And judging by how many times I died while trying to get through that place, it's a pretty popular vacation location within the simulation. Likely because it's the only choice. But really, even the places in which they live are beautiful, picturesque places. They mainly have two environments available for the Alks to live in. The first is built in the middle of a vast lake so large it stretches as far as the eye can see. But of course, the Alks' houses and buildings are built on their iconic stilts to combat the varying levels of water a lake would throw at the buildings. But there's just something about being here, with the beautiful lights dotting the pretty houses and buildings surrounding you, a nice, well-looking structure in the middle of it all, and the brilliance of the simulated sky around you that just makes it feel serene here. I mean, if this place had Wi-Fi, I think I could spend a couple 100,000 years relaxing here, even if there were neck-snapping crazy owl creatures nearby. And depending on your preference, this might not even be the nicest area. Far into the deep dark woods, on a small island surrounded by rivers, flowers, and lily pads, we find a couple of houses, lonely just sitting on the edge of the water. If it weren't for the inhabitants here acting in strange ritualistic ways, these houses might be even more peaceful than the Stilt City. With only a few houses built deep into the woods, the Alks who lived here must have really enjoyed their peace and quiet, and maybe even privacy, but I'd have a hard time deciding where I'd want to live between those two. The prisoner has seemed to have found a middle ground in where they originally lived, being in the Starlet Cove, but with their house built with a mountain between them and the rest of the city. So the prisoner would have both the option for their peace and privacy while still being close to the main hustle and bustle of the Starlet Cove. I'm guessing they came here specifically for the view. But the Alks have a few interesting buildings in particular that I want to talk about. The first would be the super sneaky house deep in the forest, the one with the entrance hidden beneath a huge tree. But now that I mention it, I suppose the building isn't all that interesting in and of itself, but what we find there is interesting. It turns out that the 20 or so minutes that we have in the simulation is meeting time for the Alks in the forest. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here or what they're doing, but as we approach it, we can hear they are playing their music pretty loudly, and apparently they can tell as soon as we enter the building. Just peeping into the building, we see one Alk standing in front of a large fireplace, and a group of Alks have gathered here and are lining up around the building and just standing around. I have to imagine that this is some kind of ritual they're participating in or getting ready for. They may even be getting together for some kind of religious ceremony, and the Alk up front may be the preacher or something similar, but they have a bunch of plants spread all across the floor, and it's sort of open, and the floor plan seems pretty unique, so this building may be dedicated to this event. But sadly, before these Alks do whatever they were going to do, the tower housing the fire that they are connected to floods, and their fire extinguishes, forcing all of the Alks here out of the simulation. But either way, it seems like even after all of these years, the Alks still have a social lives and events in which they gather and spend time with each other. The other building that I find particularly interesting is the one that leads to the hidden library in the Starlet Cove. You go down a set of stairs in the center of the village's lake, and a doorway seems built into the cliff's face beneath the lake. And it's hard to describe this building, but I suppose I'd describe it as a hall. A floor with wide open areas with pillars all throughout it. At first glance, this place may seem like a strange stage or performing area or something like that, but after actually looking through it and paying attention, I think this is a digital graveyard or memorial of sorts. All over these walls and pillars in the buildings are cabinets, and inside of these cabinets are portraits of Alks. Below each of these portraits are small containers, and the majority of them have flowers there as well. And all of the portraits on the far walls are all lit up independently. I didn't really think about it at first, but the Alks are still able to do things inside the simulation that would kill them, and I suppose not all of them would unload the character. So instead of having a normal graveyard where they'd bury their friends, they've had to come up with another way to commemorate their lost loved ones that may have been deloaded. I'm not entirely sure what would be inside the small containers though. Usually they would be urns, so maybe even if they die in the sim, the body remains, but some certain death gets you deloaded. But it's hard to know what this all means. Though the lit pictures do suggest that these Alks were likely more important than the other ones. They were likely Alks that held high positions or had great respect in the community. But after inspection, I'm almost positive that this place is meant to commemorate the Alks who either got deloaded from the simulation or even maybe died while inside. So again, even after all of these years, the Alks still had feelings. They loved each other and mourned the loss of their friends. They're seemingly a relatively normal species, albeit living in a simulation. But there seems to be some evidence that not all of the Alks were living in a perfect harmony all this time. And I'm not simply talking about the prisoner, though I suppose we should talk about them first. As I mentioned in the last video, the Alks imprisoned a specific Alk in the dream world for turning off the eye silencing probe. They used a below-the-ground glitch to house this prison and traps associated with them. They forced our friend inside of a vault and sealed it with 3 mystic seals of light that spawn chains. It's a simulation, just roll with it. Inside the vault is a set of stairs that go even further down than the apparent floor beneath the world. But to my surprise, locked inside this tiny vault, the area opens up pretty widely. It's surely a secure prison, but the inside resembles any other building you'd find inside the simulation. In fact, it's kinda nicer than the normal houses in my opinion. Not only is it a 2-story tower fit with elevators, but the tower is actually all decked out with the amenities for the prisoner to pass their time with. Sadly, they are alone, but they even allowed them to keep their lantern, which at least lets them feel like they are still themselves instead of a green simulated code monster. And they do have their vision staff. Plus, they even allow them to keep their most prized possession, or at least a copy of it, their telescope. But this is where it actually gets kind of touching. Remember, our friend is deep below the dream world, completely sealed off from the simulated sky above. So really, they'd have nothing to look at through their telescope. But even these evil-looking Alks weren't heartless. It seems the Alks weren't so cruel as I'd imagined when it comes to their prisoner. Not only do they allow him to have all the normal amenities any other Alk would have, but they even coded in or created a mini version of the ring planet specifically for the prisoner. I mean, they even positioned it below the surface of the dream world in the exact right spot for the prisoner to be able to see it out of their window, and it's hidden from almost everyone else. It's specifically for them. Even though this was a prisoner that deserved to be locked up for their supposed horrible actions, the Alks still had the heart to go out of their way to give the prisoner something to comfort them, something to remind them of home. This shows me that the Alks weren't as heartless as it felt the first time through the DLC. But this is where it sort of gets interesting. Throughout my explainer videos, I kept saying that most of the Alks decided to go live in the simulation forever, and I made sure to make it clear that it's possible some of them decided to live on and hop back and forth between the real and dream world well after most retreat. The reason I say this is because we find some things in the real world and even the dream world that seem out of place if all of the Alks went to sleep forever after imprisoning our friend and they were all on the same page. This could just be one of those things where I'm just looking way too deep into game design choices, but we find that the codes created for the prisoner to be freed eventually were destroyed in both the real world and the dream world. Plus, the controls for the diving bell for the prisoner is burned out. We find hints and rails in convenient places pointing towards the steps to free the prisoner in the dream world. And we even get a vision from the prisoner's vault itself that leads us to the hints to find the burnout codes in the real world, which, why would they know that? Now again, game design wise, this all does make sense. The glitch reels are one of the few accessible in the hidden libraries because we as a player need to find them. They created and burned the codes to be a red herring for us to search for a long time, only to learn that that's a dead end. They hid reels in the real world because we needed pieces to the puzzle instead of having it all solved at once. And the prisoner's vault gives us a vision to make it easy to understand these are the codes that will allow us into the vault. But after having studied Outer Wilds, the base game, it's hard for me to just accept that these were simply game design choices. There is almost nothing that we find in the base game that doesn't have some kind of explanation unless it's meant to be a mystery. So this leaves me with two options. Just sit down and accept the fact that it's a series of game design choices necessary because it's a DLC and they didn't have all that much time to make it, or they added a bunch of contextual and environmental clues to these key objects to try to tell a story without text. And honestly, I'm leaning towards the latter, but since it's not certain, and I could probably talk about it for a long time, that should probably go in its own video. One thing that we should probably touch on in this video is the after story. I talked about the story from their home moon to where we find them on the Stranger, but it turns out most of the stuff that I just talked about is no longer happening at the end of the loop. After about 15 minutes into the loop, the dam is completely broken and 2 of 3 out of the normal towers that host fires gets extinguished. Interestingly, this doesn't get rid of that location inside the dream world, but it does deload or disconnect the Alks that were in that building since their artifact was extinguished. The only inhabitants still in the simulation at the end of the loop are the ones in the hotel and the prisoner. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you want to look at it, it seems both of those locations are actually really safe and almost at no danger of having their base fires extinguished. A certain ending tells us that the Stranger lives on for a seemingly long time after the loop ends and the whole simulation's still there. It's very likely that these two areas stay lit all throughout this time. The inhabitants stationed in the hotel would likely notice they are the last ones left, but it's almost certain that the prisoner would have stayed in the dark on this one. I sort of wish I could definitely give everyone an answer about the odd things I pointed out earlier, and whether or not they're game design or lore choices hidden for us to find, but trust me, I'm going to keep studying that. All it will be doing is getting environmental clues to figure out the story, and I suppose this video is a lot of that as well. But it's interesting to look at it in detail and see what they've been doing for the last 200,000 plus years, and how this simulation may have affected them as a species. To be honest, they don't seem so different after 200,000 years of the same simulation. Honestly, I don't see much of a difference between the prisoner's vault and tower and the AUK simulation as a whole. They're both a confined space you can never get out of, so I'm kind of surprised it hasn't affected them more. Anyway, let me know what everyone thinks about the two unique buildings connected to the entrance of the hidden libraries. The one with a large fireplace and congregation of AUKs, and the one with the pillars and pictures of AUKs, which I think to be a memorial. And let me know what you guys think about the game, design versus lore debate as well. But that's just about all I have with this video. I am really glad that I decided to continue on and give this series an episode 3. There was definitely enough to keep me interested personally, so hopefully everyone else enjoys it as well. As usual, a special thank you to the members here on the channel. I really appreciate the support, and as always, this is the Lore Explorer diving deep into the dream world so you don't have to be digitally murdered by a bunch of AUKs. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.